This thing was quiet for a long time, ever since the chime works on this exploded, quite literally. One of the shafts inside broke on their pivot, and that of course allowed the spring to release all the tension it had, ripping gears apart, snapping shafts, and rendering the clockwork pretty much useless. So what I did back then was take the clockwork apart and remove every stock shaft that had to do with the chimes, and leaving the clockwork itself, which indicates the time, intact. That of course left this clock quiet, and for some reason it just started bothering me. So it took me a long time to find out what the clockwork in this thing actually is, because there was no maker's mark on there and no stamps to indicate what type it was. But luckily I found a clockwork which might be a suitable substitute, at least from the sizes of the pointers and their shaft diameters and from the distances of the winding posts. I'm pretty positive we can substitute that movement into this clock and give it back its voice. This guy here is going to be our substitute. Luckily, the chimes do work on this one. The gear train to drive the pendulum and the pointers is okay too. As you can see, when I apply pressure here, the pendulum is starting to move. However, when I go to load it up, does that look familiar? So yeah, we've got a broken spring, and to fix that, the whole thing will have to come apart. Before I try and fix this spring, which is broken quite far inwards and which is going to be quite a nightmare to try and drill a new notch into here like I did on the gramophone, I'm thinking we might be able to use the spring on this clockwork. You know, we might just get lucky. So I think it's worth taking a look at this guy here and see if we can make any use of it. Well, as you can clearly see, the springs are not the same. The width of the housing is nearly though, and this one is slightly less in diameter. But I think if we use this spring not to drive the clockwork but the chimes, then this is going to do just fine. And I just want to give you a quick look at these teeth here. You can see why this thing gave up the ghost. And this gear here as well. You can see this one is knocked over. And these ones are facing that way. Completely toast. But the spring is still good. Okay, so our substitute spring is probably 1.5 mm shallower, which is not a big deal because it'll fit into the drum nicely. And the centerpiece here will also fit in the center here very nicely. This one is smaller in diameter than that one. However, this one does 9 turns and this one does as well. So, you know, if we try to fix this guy up, then we'd have to bend the entire inner coil tighter and tighter, and that would make the spring in turn smaller. So I'm thinking this one is actually going to be a valuable substitute, especially because we're probably only going to use it as the drive spring for the chimes. It took quite a while to get everything aligned properly. First of all, the clockwork with the dial in the front, and then of course the chimes with the hammers, because if it's too close, then the hammers will come to rest on the thing and dull it right down. If it's too far away, the hammers won't hit at all. And then of course there's that whole intermediate spectrum where the hammers can be at different heights and therefore produce different volumes of the tone itself. So, you know, it was quite a bit of work, and I couldn't film it unfortunately because I had both my hands in here just wiggling around, tightening bolts, screwing around, and, you know, there was no room for the camera. So, my apologies for that, but you get to hear the results here. So all that remains to be seen is whether or not it will last at least a week, because I wind these things up once a week, and if it doesn't, then it's going to be taking the whole thing apart again and assembling or repairing the old spring and putting that in, which hopefully is going to do the trick, but you know, my hopes are pretty high on having it run as is, because taking a watch apart or a clock apart, not one of my favorite things. So maybe it's a two-parter, we don't know yet, but we shall see. Goodbye!